Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the 18th Annual Town History Series at the Patent Free Library. My name is Mary Kate Kwasnick, and I am the new Archivist and Special Collections Librarian at the Sagadahoc History and Genealogy Room at the Patent Free Library. Many of you know reference librarian Jack Martin, who has very graciously agreed to let me host the rest of the series. Thank you, Jack, for your incredible work on this year's series. Today's presentation is sponsored by Now You're Cooking. We thank them for their generous support of today's talk. I also want to thank all of the historical societies in our 5 member towns for selecting this year's wonderful speakers and helping us get the word out. Thank you to Peter Goodwin and Robin Haynes, both former managers of the History Room and founders of the Town History Series. And finally, thank you to our audience. Thank you for building such incredible momentum for this year's series and every year before this. It's a really beautiful thing to see. This 18th Annual Town History Series is dedicated in memory of Joseph Charles Sy, who passed away in July of 2021. Joe was a History Room volunteer for over 22 years, and during that time, he was instrumental in creating and maintaining the memory database, which indexes obituaries in our newspapers. If you've ever come into this room and had the librarian find an obituary for you in just moments, you really have Joe to thank for that. This is a Zoom webinar, so you will notice that you cannot unmute or turn on your camera, but you can use the chat and the Q&A feature. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A at any time during the talk, and at the end of the presentation, we'll facilitate that Q&A with our speaker. If you need to communicate with myself or Jack about any tech issues, you can use the chat feature, and we'll do whatever we can to help. If we don't get a chance to answer all of your questions today, you're welcome to email us at history@patent.lib.me.us, and we can forward them on to our speaker. Our speaker today represents the Woolwich Historical Society. Allison Hepler is a Woolwich resident, state representative for House District 53, a town select woman, a board member of the Patent Free Library, the Woolwich Historical Society, and Maine's First Ship. In addition to all of that, Allison is a history professor at the University of Maine Farmington and a published author. Last summer, Allison presented at the Patent Free Library on her book, McCarthyism in the Suburbs, Quakers, Communists, and the Children's Librarian at a History Room Live event. We are so pleased to welcome her back to Patent Free Library for her talk today on Montsweek Farm. Allison would like to recognize that so many people have worked at Montsweek Farm over the many years of its operation, and she requests that anybody who would like to share a story of working there do that in the chat at any time today. And at the end of today's talk, we can share that with the group. So anything you'd like to share, please feel free to take some time to think about it and type it in the chat. So with all that being said, we are so happy to welcome Allison. Hi, Allison.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. There we go. So, hi. Everyone, greetings on behalf of the Woolwich Historical Society. So the last history presentation I did for this series was Woolwich Cemeteries, telling the stories of dead people. For this project, as Mary Kate says, I got to talk to a lot of live people. So confession, this is more fun, talking to live people. Okay, I did hear that there's a ghost, but we'll get to that later. So my hope is that this presentation will reconnect people, a reunion of sorts, because of course, I didn't get a chance to talk to everyone connected with Montsweek Farm or Montsweek Restaurant or Montsweek Roadhouse or simply the restaurant. However, the word I heard over and over again was home. This is like a home to us. So this morning, maybe you'll find your old buddy, the bartender in this group, or the waitress who made your top-notch Manhattans, or the cook who you worked with, who lived upstairs. So please, as Mary Kate said, please type your memories and connections in the chat. We'd love to share them and connect people. And so with that, and with thanks to those who did take the time to talk with me and share their artifacts, I present From Apples to Ale, A History of Montsweet Farm. So if this were live, I'd start by asking for a show of hands of who's worked here, who's eaten here. If you haven't raised your hand, I know you've driven by this icon of Route 1 in Woolwich. In fact, I'm willing to bet that if you started your career as a Mainer by being a tourist, you drove by it 100 times on your way to somewhere else and finally decided to make that left-hand turn across traffic. I worked for years at Shelter Institute just up the street and have been met with the same response. I've been driving past here for years and I finally decided to stop in. Of course, Shelter has a right-hand turn going north and not south. So I love using vehicles to estimate the age of a photo and what's going on in it. In my family, males are better able to pinpoint this, unless you've seen My Cousin Vinny and looked at and appreciated the Marissa Tomei character in this. So this is, I think this is from an old section of Route 1. This is a farm and it looks like an apple barn, and we're thinking, the male in my family thinks it's like 1930s. This is possibly from the 1960s. So there's the Saab there. This is probably, this kind of looks like my Dodge Dart from the 1970s. And this, of course, is from today. I'm starting, so the date on this, on the building that you'll see says 1939. And that's when the Butler family opened an apple barn in an orchard that was operated by Ray Dunklin and Alan Jewett. Harold Sonia acquired the property and sold the property to Sumner and Elena Sewell of Bath in 1952. Some of you may recall that Sumner served as Maine's governor during World War II. He served 2 terms from 1941 to 1945. According to longtime owner Nick Sewell, the decision to buy the barn came from 2 sources. One, his father Sumner was looking for something to do. In 1948, he lost a Republican Senate primary to a person who would go on to become the first woman elected to the US Senate who had not been previously appointed to serve, Margaret Chase Smith. So I guess if you have to lose, it's not a bad person to lose to. Sumner also had returned to the local maritime industry, opening a small lobster pound on Hermit Island, which many of you I'm sure have been to, and he had bought that in 1948. Second, Nick's mother, Elena, had started a small tree nursery on the grounds of the recently deactivated Brunswick Naval Air Station right after World War II. Then it was reactivated in 1951, but then she had about 100 red pine and spruce trees to move. So after the purchase of the farm, she transplanted them to the grounds. And some of those trees, Nick says, are still on the property. So like I said, the place was an apple barn. There was a small orchard, although most of the tree apples came from Buxton, Maine. In addition to selling apples, Elena ran a small nursery and did some cider pressing. And the apples were award-winning. This predates the purchase by the Sewells, but this is from 1928, awarded 2nd prize in competition Maine State Pomological Society Fruit Tree Show in November. Lewiston Armory, the 1st prize was in 1928. McIntosh Reds, Northern Spies, and Baldwins. And we think that that monument in the center is actually made of apples. The apples came in what we now consider the upstairs. They were sorted upstairs and then dropped down chutes into the bottom floor. And in the restaurant today, you can see in that picture in the upper right, the chutes are still in the ceiling. As Nick tells it, he began the food operations on a rainy day when he and his friend Ben Priest dragged a 6x6 beam and an old grill to a corner of the barn and began making hamburgers for the apple customers. He calls this period the Hamburg era. He also used bricks from a chimney that had collapsed. Sometimes, he said, depending on how the wind was blowing, the smoke from the grill would billow back inside. and presumably entice the Apple customers if they weren't overwhelmed by the smoke. The second piece of equipment he bought was a commercial oven, which they used to supplement the hamburger menu with a few other dishes. They soon hired a retired chef, Captain Emery, who is known to just about everyone I talked to. He's in the middle of this image. He apparently worked there for about 5 years and lived in a room upstairs. He died there and apparently never left. He still appears to staff and the occasional guest. People like longtime worker Jackie Jones recalls hearing voices upstairs when she was there with one other worker. Gaius and Amy's son asked when walking upstairs in the restaurant, "Who's that man?" No one saw anyone. Lights would suddenly go out. One of the former owners, Paul Colleen, had a propane delivery guy who heard talking. "Sounds like you have some people upstairs," he said. "There's no one there," replied Paul. Paul said the guy kind of freaked out and said, "You know, I'll just come back another time." Current owner Wayne Westcott has heard the silverware clanging in the bus buckets when he was the only one in the building. So I love now and then photos, which are sprinkled throughout this presentation. I like how things have changed and sometimes how they've not changed. This is the upstairs now. And this is that same railing downstairs. This is what it looked like then. All right, so Montsuigue Farm was a place where everyone felt like family. For teenagers who worked there in the 1980s, it was a place of bonding, not only with their peers, but also with the adults around them. "They treated us like adults," says Jason Shaw. "We worked hard, 50 hours a week while I was in high school, but working there gave us an opportunity to meet so many grown-ups in the community. Nick and Jean came to my wedding. They also came to graduations," he said. Jason worked there alongside his sister Tammy and his brother Stacy. All of them talked of the friends they'd made while working at the restaurant. If you look at the high school yearbook, you'll see so many references to the swig, says Tammy. But you worked really hard. You might have an official title like hostess or waitress or bartender or cook, but you multitasked. If something needed to be done, you did it. You really had to hustle, Tammy recalled. The adults who worked there also spoke fondly of the family-like atmosphere they felt. Jackie Jones was one. She worked there from 1970 to 1994. She began as a kitchen girl, then moved to hostess and then waitress and occasional bartender. She started, she says, as the youngest waitress and then became the oldest one by the time she retired. She also told me that when she would drive to work in the 70s from Wiscasset to the restaurant, she would pass no cars on the road. She also talked of two women who would come for a couple of drinks and then they would simply back out onto Route 1, apparently without incident. So even though you got to dress up as a hostess, it was as a waitress that you got to know people. Regulars were people whose names are familiar to Woolwich: the Hennons, the DeWicks, the Reeds. Even today, says Jackie, I see people, and while I might not remember their name, I remember what they ate and I remember what they drank. One of her favorite people was Mrs. Preble, who had recently been widowed. She'd come in alone, recalled Jackie, and order a cocktail, a Manhattan straight up. When Jackie would come back and asked if she wanted to order food, Mrs. Preble instead ordered a second Manhattan. Again, Jackie returned to ask about ordering food. Oh no, said Mrs. Preble, I just want to sit and enjoy my glow. The 1980s were a busy time for the restaurant. On Mother's Day and Easter, police were called to direct traffic. There would be lobster dinners for 100, Jason recalled, who remembers having a lot of cookers at the ready. Jason and Tammy, oops, I went a little too fast there. Jason and Tammy also recalled that customers would fly into the Wiscasset airport for a meal and fly home. The tips were great, said Jason, so you'd volunteer to go pick them up. This was also the years when Man Yankee was in operation, and when there'd be a shutdown every 18 months, lots of workers would file in there for lunch. Jackie was often the only one working the lunch crowd. Every table was full, she said. There were also those 3 martini BIW lunches, she recalled. So there's a restaurant review from 1979 that appeared in a Connecticut newspaper. And here I'm going to go off on a little bit of the Woolwich chip that we carry on our shoulders, just a little bit. The review starts like this. If there's a chance to sample only one by the wayside down east restaurant as you go, let it be the Montswig on Route 1 in Maine, east of Bath, but short of Wiscasset. It's okay, we're used to this. However, the review goes on to talk about the restaurant's neighborliness, an observation of the high school graduation going on upstairs, and a sense of a place, quote, geared to success with rapid turnover, something for which travelers are often grateful, although there was no sense of being hurried as we ate. The reviewer also mentioned, quote, the efficient young woman with a fine Maine accent who hustled up drinks for the whole room, and maybe that was Jackie Jones. The restaurant was supported by a staff in Bath, which went through the handwritten slips from the waitresses. They were very thorough, says Tammy. I lived in fear that there was a mistake in addition because they would find it, right? This was the pre-computer age where you wrote orders on slips of paper and handed it to the cooks, and you did your own addition. The restaurant was also a place where Nick would try out different things for the community. One year, he had Jack Shaw create some trails through the orchard, and in the winter, he'd use them to hold sleigh rides for the neighborhood. The horses came from Harold Fowler of Wiscasset, and if you look the picture on the bottom right, that's definitely Jack Shaw. During a couple of summers, the farm was host to a couple of cows that belonged to a waitress, and they'd hang out there where the parking lot is now along Route 1. Nick had found an old cast iron tub for their water. This was also the time where geese took up residence in a pond above a waterfall that a friend had built at the restaurant. The problem was the geese liked to watch what was happening on Route 1 by sitting on Route 1. And this was a problem. The sheriff would be called and we'd have to shoo them back off the road. Place here. Oh, yeah. I asked Nick how he found people to work there. He smiled and said, it was basically whoever was working at the time. The person wanting the job would come in and we'd all meet him. We hired Santos Cruz that way. That's him in the picture. A Puerto Rican gentleman who had just finished his post at the Coast Guard in Popham. Santos initially worked at the snack bar at Harmon Island and then took over as chef. He married his wife, Nancy, and moved into one of the cabins on the property. He eventually became the manager. Another longtime worker was Benjamin Lincoln, who was the groundskeeper. He did the lawn and cleaned the property as well as inside custodial duties. He had worked for Elena Sewell back when she had the apple orchard and eventually lived in one of the cabins until he died. And it was this cabin that you can see that's just beyond the parking lot. Jason Shaw remembers another way you could get hired. Be on the list of applicants if someone didn't show up for work. Okay, call the next person. Famous people came into the restaurant. Paul Newman, Kirstie Alley, some race car drivers whose names I don't remember, Charles Kuralt, and Gary Merrill. So I was lucky enough to get some menus from, this was from the Bath Print Shop and also from the new owner of the restaurant. And what I really like, it's worth spending a little bit of time on these. What I really like are the names of, first of all, on the front page, this is the front page of the menu. It's not seafood, it is steak, right? The square rigger, the best you can buy, the split mainsail, same but smaller, and then the spinnaker special. Here's a menu that's slightly newer, and you can look at They've added a spanker special, which is a luncheon steak. And then there's also the Spinnaker special is the hamburger lunch. And maybe that's a throwback to what Nick was when he had the Hamburg era. Here's what I also like is that I've heard of this story from a couple of people is that you could broil it yourself as a customer. You could, if and when the captain is not hurried and is in good humor. He said, we'll supply the food, the tools, but you are responsible for the results. In other words, even if you burned it, you had to buy it. Right? Here's some other, here's the lobster prices, and you can see some of the prices on this one are a quarter and a pounder for $1.90. I also really like on the right-hand side, if you didn't like lobster, you get from the nearby coops, from the coastal flats when the diggers are digging, from the fishing boats when they come in, and from the can when the boats don't come in. Really appreciate that. And then here's some of the lobster prices had gone up. This was from, I don't know how old the first menu is, but the second one goes to, is dated 1983, and the pound and a quarter was $5.85. And here's the back page, which talks about some of the sandwich between decks over the rail, and continuing again with the nautical theme. Although on the new one, which is on the right-hand side, there's no dessert, but that worries me a little bit, but I'm sure there was dessert. The same reviewer from Connecticut commented on this, the menus. Every so often the menu goes whimsical. I would love to know what specifically she was referring to, because actually, frankly, I think there's a lot that's whimsical. Right? So here's another food-related item here. In 1983, Ford Motor Company created a national magazine of recipes and printed 2 recipes from the restaurant. Nick received a letter from a woman in Colorado saying, quote, I made this scallop casserole for Christmas Eve dinner and it was an absolute catastrophe. The mixture of A1 sauce and lemon juice absolutely overwhelmed the other ingredients. We simply could not eat it. At $12 a pound for scallops out here, I am most anxious to know what went wrong. I hope you can offer an explanation. Well, Alice Adams, who worked in the office in Bath, responded to this woman and told her that there was an error in the printing of the recipe, noting that the sauce ingredients as printed was for 30 servings, not 4 to 6. Adams asked the letter writer to please share the costs incurred for making the casserole because, quote, Mr. Nicholas Sewell would like to reimburse you for the cost of your ingredients. I don't know what happened after that, but there we go. When you talk to former staff or any of the regulars, you get to hear a lot about the decor and some of the infrastructure. One ad from the 1980s described the decor as nautical hand-me-downs. You could also see that from the menu. Here we see their ship models, nautical paintings. There's a ship's bell in the back. Some of the lights here look like they could have been on boats. In the center, you can see a ship's wheel, which was put horizontally, and a big sheet of glass on top of it. That was their largest table. Tammy Given recalls that they like to impress customers that when they'd clean it, she and another waitress would lift it up and flip it over. And since it never broke, we assumed that all was well. She said people like to leave fingerprints underneath the glass for some reason. But you can also see a half-hull model in the back. This is actually the wall in the private dining room upstairs came from doors of a Sewell family home. You can even see the doorknobs there. And one of the most prominent artifacts upstairs was a large political banner when Nick's great-grandfather, Arthur Sewell, ran for vice president in 1896 alongside William Jennings Bryan. This is not the banner, but I assume it may have looked something like this. There was a large pot-bellied stove that stood. You can see this in the picture on the left. It stood and heated the front of the restaurant. It now lives upstairs on a porch. The main part of the restaurant also included a live lobster tank, which you can't see here, an open grill, like, you know, where you could cook your own steak, and an open kitchen. In that kitchen stood a built-in place wooden walk-in refrigerator. Also, there was a dumbwaiter that served the upstairs kitchen and sometimes served as emergency exit for the staff. Here's another picture of the interior downstairs, which really shows a lot of some of what it looked like in the 1980s. The blue plates, which were still being used in the early 2000s, the stacks of glasses, the pot-bellied stove, the dishes. The bar was back in the background in the corner there. There's a lot going on here. And you can see on the right-hand side, the light coming in, and that's your sort of touchstone. That's where the windows of the restaurant come in from the Route 1 side. One of the most beautiful times, according to Jackie Jones, was Christmas. It was beautiful, she recalled. Lots of greenery, a red and green plaid rug in front of the fireplace upstairs, and a real festive look. So billboards, I have to talk about billboards. The state of Maine banned billboards in 1978, becoming the second state to do so. Somehow, the one across the street from the restaurant had been grandfathered and remains in operation and is still legal. The land is actually still owned by the Sewells, who rent it to the current owner for $1 a year. And from top right to bottom left, you can see the different iterations that it's gone through. This billboard for the restaurant didn't fare so well. Almost immediately after we put it up, the state told us it had to come down, said Nick. We cut it down, but, and he winked, the posts are still there. And they still are. I saw them yesterday. So any building constructed in the 1930s has changed and has changed uses a number of times, is bound to stress the systems that were in place. Initially, there was a private well that fed the barn and the restaurant. Nick remembered that it stopped working one New Year's Eve, but his plumber from Small Point came up and saved the day. He actually may have done that more than once. The private well has since been replaced, and the private septic system is still in place, although it's been upgraded. And there are current plans to connect the septic system to the town of Wiscasset Water District. There's also a water tower for the orchard that was pumped up. Yeah. While the systems change and get upgraded, the connections among the staffers remain. Former staff still hold reunions. Sometimes on Sunday, we'd get together and have roast beef dinner like we used to serve at the restaurant, says Jackie. It was really like family. The subsequent owners use words like family or locals or neighbors to describe not only the staff, but also the clientele. So yes, times change. Nick closed the restaurant and then leased the building for a short time to Dan Sigurdson, who opened Dan's Steakhouse for a short time. But it was a for sale sign that attracted the attention of Paul and Liz Colleen on one of their many vacation trips to Maine. They were Long Island residents and parents of 3 children. The Colleen stopped, looked in the windows, and contacted Nick, whose phone number was on the for sale sign. Nick tried to talk me out of buying it, recalls Paul, who was a bond broker on Wall Street at the time. But Nick and Paul stayed in touch. Paul was on the 26th floor of the World Trade Center's North Tower on September 11th, 2001, when the first hijacked plane hit his building. Paul says since he was a firefighter at college, he didn't initially head to the exit. Only after seeing the TV coverage that started to show up did he and others head downstairs. One of the exits was twisted and had collapsed. It took them a half hour to reach the lobby. He says, we were walking down single file while the firefighters were coming up the stairs. I have never forgotten their faces, he told me 20 years later. It never goes away. He says he spoke to his wife sometime during that day and told her, we're going to buy that restaurant in Maine. He spent most of the day downtown, saw the buildings come down, and was able to get home at the end of the day. He didn't call Nick that day, but the Coolines ended up buying the place a year later. It needed a lot of work, admits Paul. He worked for 8 months to get it ready, cutting trees, hooking up water systems across Route 1 to the Wiscasset Water District line. Having grown up in New York, says Paul, I had no idea how a well system worked. I dreaded hearing what it would cost to drill under the highway and hook up to the Wiscasset line. When the guy hemmed and hawed and then said, well, I guess we could do it for $1,200, I nearly died. He enjoyed the build out. Along with, he built the bar, the new bar you see on the right-hand side, along with the local builder, Joel Salibi. You can see the old bar to the left. The new one is actually closer to the in the center of the room. His original thought was actually to put the bar right up against the windows facing the parking lot so it could serve guests inside and out on the patio. The windows swung up and out. He eventually built the bar where it is now. He had bartended in college, so when he opened, he could also often be found behind the bar. He did a little bit of everything, he said, and Liz did the ordering and the bookkeeping. You can also see in this picture the shelves hanging above the bar, and that's been put in by the current owner, who says that you need to see the inventory, and so there's bottles up there. Paul started a comedy night, which was eventually taken over by the Taste of Maine, and had live music, which was actually more of a gamble financially, since you had to pay the band regardless of the crowd. And Paul loved hearing the stories. People would just come in and say, I worked here. He also learned never to badmouth anyone. Everyone's related, and it gets back to them. He also learned that this was a local restaurant. He'd originally imagined it as a place where tourists would stop. Traffic's moving too fast, he observed. Also, it had been a local place for years. He also adjusted the name, originally Cooline's Clam Barn, to Cooline's at Montsweet Farm. In an interview for Plymouth Magazine, which is the Plymouth State College alumni magazine, Paul said, quote, since it was a restaurant for such a long time, people around here have very fond memories of the place. We have a lot of people who remember eating here on special family events like birthdays or anniversaries. They remember the governor's desk that was here, or the old lobster tank, the charcoal grill where they cooked the steaks, or the ship's wheel in the middle of the restaurant. This is actually another picture of a then and now, or in this case, a now and then, if you're going from left to right. This was a porch that was put on the back in the 80s and on the right, and this is what it looks like today. With the Coolines in charge, Nick and Jean would come to have their Sunday dinner tradition at the restaurant. Also, Paul hired some of the local people, including Melissa Field, whose mother had worked there. And she had talked about having kind of grown up in the restaurant. There was also the day cook, Richard, who had previously worked at the restaurant. He'd lost his driver's license, said Paul, so he'd come to work on his riding lawnmower. Richard was apparently also the holder of a stuffed haddock recipe that he wouldn't share with Paul. Paul eventually got it, but he wouldn't tell me how. He also hired Juan Cassette, the assistant principal of the Wiscasset High School, as a bartender. And I can imagine what it would be like to be an underage high school kid coming up and trying to get a drink at the bar, only to have your bartender be your assistant principal. Love that. Regulations also changed. The kitchen was in good shape when Paul bought it, but some of the systems needed updated. Like I said, the septic was working, but he kept an eye on it. As a quote time bomb. He used the pot-bellied stove to heat the bar, but when the Coolines sold the restaurant, the fire department had other ideas about heating. Family health issues eventually made them decide to sell reluctantly, because both Paul and Liz loved it. They just couldn't do both. He still keeps in touch with the people he met, and he still lives in Maine. I learned a lot from the people I met, he recalled. Big Al was from the same town in Long Island, and he was one of the people he met. Paul said, he came in and asked where I lived. I said, Falmouth. Oh, no, he said. You tell him you just live down the road. It's much better. In 2006, The Coolines sold the restaurant to Jenny and Chris Johnston, who had run the lobster business in Five Islands, Georgetown. The Montswig Roadhouse was less of a restaurant and more of a bar, but continued the same music tradition. And it fell to them, unfortunately, to fix the time bomb of a septic system. So times change. Johnston sold the place to Wayne Westcott in 2018. Wayne had owned restaurants in Ogunquit, but when he came to Montswig, he had been working in Tenets Harbor as a lobsterman for a year. It was the first time since he was a kid he wasn't in the restaurant business. I was doing normal stuff, Wayne said, but at the end of the year, I realized that I really missed it. So Wayne came, here's another then and now photo, and I really like, this is on the right is the current configuration of the patio out back. And the picture on the left is when the Sewells owned it. There's not a lot of difference. I really like that. Although there's a waterfall on the left-hand side in the picture on the left that you can pretty clearly see. Wayne came to Montswig Roadhouse and found what he called a gem of a property. In April, he will have owned it for 4 years. He is attracted to its history too and has been collecting items as he finds them. Matchbooks and drawings, for instance. He also sent me one of the copies of the menu. When I first sat down with him, the first thing he said was, "I've never been a good capitalist." Most restaurant people, he said, equate the number of chairs with profits because the margins are so small. Here's speaking of chairs, here's another then and now picture. This is what the upstairs looks like on the left and what it looked like then. And you can actually catch some of the same window designs, the door almost in view on the right-hand side. Obviously the tables are different. The more Wayne gets into the restaurant business, the more he understands that it, quote, takes a special kind of weirdo to take on projects like this. Still, he says, every day feels better. He, like previous owners, has had to address the systems to keep it running. The septic is still private, but he has plans to hook up to the Wiscasset sewer system. Also, the sprinkler system is currently powered by 2 pumps and a 2-inch line that needs to be changed to a 4-inch line and hooked up to the Wiscasset Water District. I asked him about the pandemic. "We never closed," said Wayne. "We did curbside, outdoor dining, everything." And he's thankful for the customers who kept coming. "It wasn't about him or his staff," he said. "It's about the people in these communities who had a history of coming here, and they want you to be successful." So why is it black? I thought it was classy, but I wasn't sure that somebody who embraces history would have that explanation. A lot of the siding needs to be replaced, said Wayne. Until then, he's painted it black. In his future plans, he loves it here and loves the community. He wants to continue that friendly local feel. He also wants to start a garden. Here's another picture of inside. On a personal note, I have never worked in a restaurant unless you count 2 weeks at a Mr. Donut in the 1970s serving coffee, something best left forgotten. But in my years as a restaurant patron, and from talking with these former and current owners, as well as former staff, I am filled with awe at how hard you have to work to make this work. And we've been lucky to have them. I also think it looks like it's been a lot of fun. I decided to end on this slide. It's an old image. You can note the cars and the people in the drawing. Everyone who knew Emery said he was a very large man. Yes, he was, and it's his large spirit that apparently still lives at the restaurant. Thank you.